explain the coincidence of the scent of the cadaver felt by British and not Portuguese dogs?
Sandra, maybe you should be asking the judiciary because they've examined all this.
But don't you, so you don't have any explanation for that?
Ask the dogs, Sandra.
Ask the dogs, no, Jerry. Now I think that I feel free to ask you.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. You would imagine in a 15-year mystery that there might be the faintest bit of curiosity about what the European Court of Human Rights found so compelling that it ruled against the McCanns. What principal facts did they see that apparently the entire British media couldn't and still can't now? Well, under the section Principal Facts, the ECHR basically highlights 5 lines on page 2, just 5 lines from a 5-page document that is apparently still too much for the British media to analyze. Is it too difficult to understand? It is written in English, and although I'm just a simple, unsophisticated South African, though educated in the law, I'm able to understand it. And this is how it reads. Biological and blood samples were subsequently detected by British sniffer dogs inside the holiday apartment and in the trunk of a vehicle that the applicants had rented a few days after their daughter's disappearance. As a result, the parents were placed under investigation in September 2007. They were suspected of having hidden their daughter's body following her death, possibly as a result of an accident inside the apartment, and of having staged an abduction. Those proceedings were discontinued in July 2008. The one word that ought to stand out like a red flag in the short excerpt is the word dogs. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. If you're enjoying this coverage, be sure to hit the thanks icon. And let's get started. So the word dogs refers to 2 dogs, and those dogs have names. They have designations and roles, and there is video footage of the dogs inside the McCanns apartment alerting until kingdom come, and then also alerting inside the rental vehicle, and alerting on Kate McCann's clothing, and alerting on the Cuddle Cat toy in the McCann's rented villa. These aren't iffy, whimpery alerts. These are high-pitched alerts. To be clear, whenever you see or hear a dog barking, in terms of the Madeleine McCann case, that's the cadaver dog. The other dog's way of signaling is to remain silent, to kind of assume a very quiet pose. He becomes completely still. That is the sign of his alert. So the blood dog's alert and the cadaver dog's alert are totally different. In other words, whenever you hear barking, you are hearing evidence, you're hearing signaling of cadavers, and there's a lot of barking. So I think it's important to clarify that the one dog that is of the 2 dogs mentioned in the hearing from the ECHR in their ruling, one of those 2 dogs is Eddie, a specialist cadaver dog. The other dog is Keeler, a specialist in blood detection. Now, for some strange reason, if you want to read about these dogs in relation to the McCann story, you've got to go to Australia or Ireland. And if you refuse to go to Australia and you refuse to go to Ireland, well, then you've got to go backwards in time, about 14 years, 15 years. Going back in time, especially 15 years back in time, takes time. It took hours to research this article, even though I knew what I was looking for. If you go back a few months, you'll find the media narrative contaminated with the words death, dogs, and scent of death. But this will take you to the wrong rabbit hole. Something about a USB drive with suspicious images of it buried under a dog, and that has got to do with the Bruckner case. That's not the kind of dog evidence you want to look at. But it's easy to get sidetracked with that. You also don't want to read another article from 23rd September 2007, after they were made suspects, suggesting that the dogs were all the McCann's idea. And I think how they work that out. In other words, how they make the case that it was the McCanns' idea to suggest the dogs is that they hired a specialist or someone who brought in a kind of Spock's tricorder, and this person suggested that they use cadaver dogs. Well, so I suppose you could say indirectly their specialist made the recommendation, so it was their recommendation. It's not quite the same thing though, is it? The Netflix documentary has some references to the dogs, but one has to be careful because we know the documentary series is Apologia. Although it touches on the dog evidence, it nicely introduces the segment right at the end of episode 3, then cuts it off halfway through, and then brings back the other half in episode 4. So rather than telling the entire story, the entire, tell the full story in a continuous way, they slice it through the middle. And kind of in the one story they talk about the cadaver dog, in the other story they talk about the blood dog, and then they also, in other words, that's confusing in itself. And then they also have the detective saying that he doesn't believe in the dogs, and that's sort of superimposed. Now I'm sure the Netflix crew high-fived when Amaral made this concession on camera, and they made sure to superimpose his statements while the dogs were shown alerting. In other words, the whole idea was to undermine how important this evidence was, right? Do you think the ECHR also thought it wasn't very important evidence? So I do think a major weakness with Amaral was his own skepticism, because arguably the dogs saved his butt. The dogs reinforced his story. And certainly the ECHR cited that evidence because I think that they know what they're talking about. The other thing interesting with the Netflix news references is that they all seem to be focused on blood rather than cadavers. Have a look at these 4 headlines. What's the word missing from these 4 headlines? It's obviously cadaver or corpse. It just seems to be saying that they found blood. It seems to be in a way minimizing what the dogs actually found, doesn't it? So if you want to find the word cadaver and dog associated with the McCann case, you kind of have to look for it yourself, and you've got to look quite hard. It's definitely something that's not very evident in the media archive, which in itself is quite curious, wouldn't you say? But if you do look, and if you do look for long enough, you find this. From the 16th of October 2007. But most of the articles with the word death include a disclaimer, Portuguese police claim, or according to the Portuguese police. And of course the Portuguese police have been undermined and criticized and discounted all along anyway. So whatever the Portuguese police claim, are the British police or the British public going to accept it? Mixed between articles that are truthful or factual or derived from reliable sources or others that aren't, such as that Madeleine's scent was also on a friend's clothes, or that cadaver traces were found on a beach as well. No, they weren't. But the part that I want to focus on here is when Jerry and Kate were asked about the dogs in November of 2009, 13 years ago. Kate seemed kind of alarmed. It's quite interesting looking at their facial expressions. Looking at one point, Kate actually looks down while Jerry's answering. And also when Sandra Felgueiras asks her a question, Kate kind of interrupts her, right? So it is really interesting listening to this particular question with the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit of the ECHR ruling. So let's do that. I'm going to read the transcript before I play you the audio. Sandra says something like, but this is the first time that you give us a big interview, not being arguidos, in other words, suspects. Since then, so now I feel free to ask you this directly. How can you explain the coincidence of the scent of the cadaver found by British and not Portuguese dogs? Kate then answers, Sandra, maybe you should ask the judiciary because they have examined all the evidence. Well, Kate, the highest judiciary in Europe has examined the evidence now. They found it quite important. Anyway, the journalist goes on to say, so do you have an explanation for that? Jerry, who seems to be smirking, says, ask the dogs, Sandra. And Sandra kind of indignantly says, ask the dogs? No, Jerry, now I feel free to ask you. Don't you feel free to answer me? And Jerry then does answer. He says, I can tell you that we have also looked at evidence about cadaver dogs, and they are incredibly unreliable, right? And we know what that evidence was, the Zapata case. And of course, the Zapata case, when they first looked at it, it appeared to be unreliable, only for it to turn out to be reliable. That is the lesson from the Zapata case. Sandra kind of responds quite genuinely. You just see the disbelief written all over her face. She says, unreliable? Jerry says, cadaver dogs, yes. That's what the evidence shows, if they are tested scientifically. Now, if you think about the combination of the following terms mentioned in the ECHR documents, it's just mentioned fleetingly, but if you put them all together, the following terms: biological and blood samples, British sniffer dogs inside apartment 5A, in the trunk of the vehicle, and following her death. All of these terms infer one thing: a cadaver. Because it deals not merely with sniffer dogs, but a cadaver dog, cadaver odor, and the assertion of death. Sandra goes on to ask, are you saying that Gonzalo Amaral doesn't have the right to share his opinion, his conviction under the evidence he gathered into a book? He doesn't have freedom of expression to say that and to publish it. That is exactly the ambit of the ECHR ruling and what they were asked to deal with. That was the precise ambit of the complaint, right? And so it's quite interesting, again in hindsight, revisiting this question and getting Jerry's answer on it. And this is what Jerry says. Specifically with, does Gonzalo Amaral have the right to share his opinion? And Jerry then says, there's a difference between freedom of expression and evidence to support a theory. Well, what do you think the evidence was to support Amaral's theory? Wasn't it this cadaver dog evidence? He goes on to say, what the judges have said, there isn't evidence to support this theory, so he shouldn't be saying it. Well, you can see that the ECHR felt different about this idea of no evidence whatsoever. Sandra then goes on to say, the files were closed and no thesis won. How can you explain that after Gonzalo Amaral, another investigator also pursued the same thesis as Gonzalo Amaral? He also investigated the possibility of you both playing a key role in Madeline's disappearance. Jerry then answered, it was investigated, the evidence was presented to the judiciary, and the judiciary concluded there was no evidence to support that thesis. Sandra then responds saying, no DNA, but how do you explain? So I think what Jerry is saying is that there's no evidence to support, but the reality is the evidence was insufficient. In other words, it's not true to say there's no evidence. It is true to say there's evidence, but it's insufficient. It's not 100% certain what that evidence shows. In this respect, Jerry said to Sandra, he said, the DNA is only one aspect of it. There was no evidence to support our involvement in Madeline's disappearance. That's the key thing. Now, the interesting thing is, a couple of days later in Salon, on September 18, 2007, somebody asked a question. They said, can you trust a cadaver dog if there's no cadaver? And it specifically referenced the Madeleine McCann case. It referenced the smell of death on Madeline's cuddle cat and her mother's clothes. And then they said, you know what? But they never found a body. Can you trust a cadaver dog if there's no cadaver? And then the journalist answers his own question, saying, not really. Not really, especially if a lot of time has gone by. And then also saying, it's not clear if a detectable scent could linger on her mother's clothes for all that time. Well, where do you think true crime has come since the past 15 years, since that article was written? Do you think cadaver traces are reliable without a body? After covering true crime for almost a decade, it's clear to me that cadaver dogs are often extremely reliable, and there doesn't seem to be a time limit on it either. What seems to be the case is everyone remembers and then everyone forgets. And human memory seems to be very convenient about what it wants to remember and what it doesn't want to remember, particularly when there are mistakes involved. It appears to be a lot easier to forget certain narratives when we've not been quite right about them. But isn't that the same as lying or covering up? Can the British media not see because they won't see? Is it also a case here of not wanting to see because there is no financial incentive in it? It's not the story Britons want to read, and so rather than sell them a story they do want to read, is it a case of facts be damned?
Portuguese dogs.
Sandra, maybe you
In
should
your
be asking the
apartment.
judiciary because they've examined all this.
But don't you, so you don't have any explanation for that?
Ask the dogs, Sandra.
Ask the dogs. No, Jerry. Now I think that I feel free to ask you.
Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.